Canada's opposition leader recently said the country needs to rethink their relationship with China. So how are Canada-China relations, and what's the significance during the pandemic? In the early morning of October 8, 1970, as China's communist leader Mao Zedong learned that China and Canada were establishing diplomatic relations, he reportedly laughed and said, "We now have a friend in America's backyard." In the decades that followed, Canada helped China secure a seat on the United Nations General Assembly and become a member of the World Trade Organization. It also gave tens of millions of dollars in aid to China and sold it nuclear reactors. Canada invested hundreds of millions of dollars into the Beijing-based Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, an institute launched by China to raise funds for its global expansion campaign, the Belt and Road Initiative. But as the virus broke out, China's Canadian friend was kept in the dark, just like every other country. In February, Canada's chief public health officer argued against blocking travel from China based on advice from the World Health Organization. She herself is a WHO advisor.
The reason why the World Health Organization doesn't recommend something like this is that, in general, it may do more harm than good. China had posted the virus, genome very fast. What are they getting out of it, right? So I think the idea is to support China.
It's reasonable to believe global health officials like Tam were unaware of China's influence on the WHO at the beginning of the outbreak, although few would deny it now. Canadian physician and WHO advisor Bruce Alward repeatedly praised China's outbreak control, but refused to recognize Taiwan's efforts.
Hello?
I'm sorry, I can't hear. I couldn't hear your question.
Okay, yeah. Let me repeat the question.
No, that's okay. Let's move to another one then.
Right, because I'm actually curious on talking about Taiwan as well, on Taiwan's case.
The WHO has blocked Taiwan from joining the organization under pressure from China. Calls are now growing in Canada to rethink the country's relationship with the Chinese regime. Many, in fact, have been calling for the rethink since before the outbreak.
We need to have a reset in that relationship with the government of China.
China's reaction to the arrest of Huawei CFO was the wake-up call. In December 2018, at the request of the United States, Canada arrested Meng Wanzhou. Meng is Huawei CFO and daughter of its founder, Ren Zhengfei, who is a former member of China's People's Liberation Army, or PLA. The U.S. charged Meng and Huawei with violating U.S. sanctions on Iran. NTD obtained group chat messages between former Huawei employees. One said he can prove that Huawei was selling sanctioned goods to Iran. The employee was later arrested by Chinese police. Right after Meng's arrest, China arrested two Canadian citizens, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spaver, a former diplomat and a businessman. The incident was seen as retaliation for Meng's arrest. Meng is out on bail and living in her multi-million-dollar Vancouver home. The two Canadians, however, are still jailed in China. Last Thursday marked 500 days since their detention. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said he had been, quote, working extremely diligently on the issue.
Chinese Communist Party does not believe in the rule of law. I mean, if your first reaction when you have a problem with Canada is you kidnap two senior Canadians, we can't work with a government like that.
But some don't see it this way. After Meng's arrest, Canada's former Foreign Affairs Minister John Manley criticized the Canadian government for arresting the Huawei CFO, saying they should have exercised a little bit of creative incompetence. According to Canadian public media CBC News, Manley sits on the board of TELUS, which, like most other Canadian telecommunications companies, has business relations with Huawei. Another of Meng's sympathizers is the former Canadian ambassador to China, John McCallum. Last January, he spoke in front of Chinese media, including state media CCTV and Xinhua, and listed out 3 arguments Meng can make before a judge to avoid extradition to the U.S. Critics say McCallum undermined the independence of Canada's judicial process by basically offering legal advice to Meng. A former ambassador to China called the comments mind-boggling. McCallum was eventually forced to resign by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Canadian media The Globe and Mail reported that when McCallum was a member of Parliament for the opposition Liberal Party, he began to travel extensively to China at the expense of Beijing-friendly groups. He took trips valued at $73,300 from China or pro-Beijing business groups.
The whole story of John McCallum ought to be a warning to Canadian politicians and the Canadian government that they have to be very careful in how they deal with the Chinese Communist Party government in Beijing and the people who they appoint to important positions in that relationship.
Trips like these are commonly used by Beijing to develop relationships with politicians. The guests are often treated with lavish dinners and luxury hotels. They are also arranged to meet with Communist Party officials. In 2006, the then mayor of Vancouver, Sam Sullivan, told the Vancouver Sun, quote, "When I go to China, they treat me like an emperor." After coming back from China, Sullivan pursued court action to shut down a long-running protest site outside the Chinese consulate in Vancouver. The site is run by practitioners of Falun Gong, a spiritual practice persecuted in China. In its 2019 annual report, Canada's Parliamentary Security and Intelligence Committee included a quote that read, "With deep coffers and the help of Western enablers, the Chinese Communist Party uses money rather than communist ideology as a powerful source of influence, creating parasitic relationships of long-term dependence." The regime started to take actions that surprised even longtime Canadian friends. The same week, China arrested the two Michaels, Margaret McQuaig Johnston, a former Canadian official and China affairs expert, discovered her locked suitcase had been searched in her Shanghai hotel room. This despite the fact that she had worked for decades to help China build up its economic institutes. McQuaig Johnston was also told by a Chinese national that the CCP has a list of 100 Canadians it could pick up at any time. Canadian media The Star reported that after going back to Canada, McQuaig Johnston started to challenge the regime's abusive behaviors. She was one of only a few longtime friends of China to do so. She encouraged Canada to pull out of the Beijing-centered Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and to use Magnitsky legislation to punish Hong Kong officials who abused human rights. She also urged the country to pay more attention to China's actions in the Indo-Pacific. And she's not alone. Last November, a veteran Chinese-Canadian politician, Richard Lee, came forward and revealed that in 2015, he was detained for 8 hours in Shanghai. He was forced to hand over his phone and passcode. Chinese authorities then reviewed confidential government information stored on it. Lee said he was targeted by the CCP for joining the commemoration of the Tiananmen Square massacre in front of Vancouver's Chinese embassy every June 4th. Lee kept silent for years. He said he didn't want to cause troubles for the Canada-China relationship, but the Chinese regime's growing infiltration into Canadian politics compelled him to speak out. In a recent interview with American thought leaders, J. Michael Cole, a China scholar and senior fellow with Canada's Macdonald Laurier Institute, said that the COVID-19 outbreak should serve as a moment of reckoning for democracies like Canada. He said countries need leadership who are more willing to challenge China.
That probably signifies a bit more confrontation. There's going to be costs. But the problem is that, especially countries like Canada, we never tested the waters. The moment Beijing threatens something or expresses displeasure, we back away, we back off, and Beijing gets what it wants. But leaders oftentimes forget, especially countries like Canada, China needs our natural resources. China wants access to certain technologies that its own people still cannot produce. So it needs us at least as much as we need it. So that should give us the ability to push back on fundamentals and values that are dear to us.